Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to tackle something that feels, well, increasingly urgent for a lot of people. Why are we, generally speaking, sicker than ever before? What's really behind this explosion of chronic illness? And maybe the more uncomfortable question, are there powerful forces, maybe benefiting from keeping us this way?
It's a huge question, right? Cuts right to the core. And for this deep dive, we're really digging into one specific source. It's an interview transcript featuring a medical doctor, and his perspective really pushes back against a lot of conventional thinking on health, especially nutrition.
Right. So our mission here is to pull out the key insights from that conversation for you. We want to help you get a handle on what this source argues is the actual root cause of all this metabolic dysfunction, how deep the diet connection goes, and the possible influence of big food and pharma marketing.
And there are some genuinely surprising points in here, like his argument for why all calories are not created equally is, well, fundamentally wrong in his view, and how looking back at historical human diets might actually hold the key to reversing conditions that, modern medicine often calls irreversible.
Okay, let's get into it. The source kicks things off by painting a pretty stark picture of health today, especially in the U.S.
Yeah, he does. He highlights some frankly, grim statistics, like over 70% of Americans overweight or obese, and more than 11% with diagnosed diabetes. Just think about that. Nearly 3/4 of adults carrying excess weight.
And what's really wild, as the source points out, is how that lines up, or rather doesn't line up, with healthcare spending. The U.S. spends, among the top 3 globally?
Yeah.
Trillions, like $4.3 trillion recently. But our actual health outcomes, we're ranked somewhere down around 65th. That disconnect is just massive.
It's huge. And this is central to his argument. He believes Western medicine often gets sort of stuck just treating symptoms, managing chronic illness with medications, instead of getting at what he sees as the fundamental root cause. And for him, that root cause almost always comes back to nutrition.
He uses a really interesting comparison early on, doesn't he? He's talking about the Hadza tribe.
Yes. The Hadza in Tanzania, one of the last hunter-gatherer groups, he holds them up as an example based on his reading and observations of a population that just doesn't seem to get these chronic diseases. No diabetes, no heart disease. Apparently they stay physically vital way longer. It's this living contrast that suggests, something fundamental is off about our modern way of eating and living.
Okay, so if just treating symptoms isn't the answer, and these historical groups seem okay, what does this doctor argue is the main underlying problem, the root cause?
His core thesis is that it boils down to metabolic dysfunction, specifically insulin resistance. He throws out a number that's just, somewhere between 86 and 93% of Americans, he estimates, are already on that spectrum, already heading towards insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. That's nearly everybody.
93%. That's incredibly alarming.
All right.
So what does metabolic dysfunction actually mean, like down at the cell level?
Okay, think of your cells having tiny engines inside them. These are the mitochondria. Their job is basically to take fuel from food and turn it into energy the body can actually use, this currency called ATP. Metabolic dysfunction, the way he describes it, is when those little engines are just not running efficiently. They're damaged, impaired, they can't produce energy properly.
So you're eating, but your body isn't actually getting the energy it needs from that food.
Pretty much. The fuel's going in, but the engine's sputtering. And the source points his finger at 2 main culprits, 2 primary drivers he believes are responsible for causing this widespread engine failure, this mitochondrial mess.
All right, let's unpack the first one. What's major problem number 1?
Seed oils. He really emphasizes how incredibly new these are in the human diet. We're talking widespread use only in the last maybe 150 years. They just weren't around for almost all of human history. And his explanation for why they're a problem is, it gets technical, but it's fascinating.
Okay, how do they actually affect us then?
So he argues these oils, especially the ones high in something called linoleic acid, which is a polyunsaturated fat, they actually get built into the membranes of our cells. And that includes the membranes inside those crucial energy engines, the mitochondria.
So they're literally changing the structure of our cellular machinery.
That's the idea. And once they're in there, he claims this linoleic acid causes something called proton leak inside the mitochondria. It's like, imagine the engine seals are leaky. Energy that should be captured to make ATP, that usable power, just leaks away as heat instead. The engine runs, but it's super inefficient, producing way less actual energy.
And this is where his whole all calories are not created equal argument really fits in, isn't it? It's not just the number, it's the type of calorie.
Exactly. He pushes back hard on that idea that you can just cut calories, eat whatever junk, and be healthy. He argues that if you're eating food packed with seed oils, even if you manage to be in a calorie deficit for a while, those ingredients are actively damaging your metabolism at the cellular level. Your engines are leaky. And this metabolic inefficiency, he suggests, is what drives that gnawing hunger, those intense cravings. It makes you eventually break and binge. It undermines long-term health, even if the scale budges temporarily. Calories from seed oils are different because they actually break the machine, basically.
He also connects this to cholesterol and heart disease, right?
Okay.
Suggesting the standard story might be incomplete.
Yes, this is a really key point for him, and he even acknowledges it's debated among experts he respects. His stance is that the primary issue isn't LDL cholesterol itself, the so-called bad cholesterol, but when that LDL becomes oxidized or damaged. And he argues that seed oils dramatically increase this LDL oxidation. That damaged, oxidized LDL, he believes, is what really drives plaque formation and heart disease.
So it's not just having LDL, it's having damaged LDL, and seed oils are doing the damaging.
That's his argument, yeah. And he contends that a lot of the older studies used to promote seed oils as heart-healthy were flawed. He says they were misinterpreted or designed poorly, leading to wrong conclusions about saturated fats versus these polyunsaturated fats from seed oils. He mentions names like the Minnesota study, Sydney, Rose, Hartz.
And didn't he also mention a possible link between seed oil intake and melanoma, skin cancer?
Yeah, he brings that up too, citing some studies suggesting a correlation as another piece of evidence for their potential harm systemically.
Okay, so seed oils mess up the mitochondria, causing energy leaks. What about culprit number 2, processed sugar? How does that cause metabolic dysfunction according to him? Is it different?
Very different mechanism, but equally damaging in his view. He argues refined sugar does cause insulin resistance, absolutely. But, and this is the twist, not primarily because it spikes your blood sugar, which is what most people think.
Okay, that's not the usual explanation. So if it's not just the blood sugar spikes, how does it lead to insulin resistance?
His proposed mechanism centers on the gut microbiome. He argues that refined sugars, think table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, they just feed the wrong kinds of bacteria in your gut. This leads to an imbalance called dysbiosis, and this imbalance makes your gut lining leakier. More bacterial components, specifically these things called lipopolysaccharides, or LPS, basically endotoxin, can then slip through the gut lining into your bloodstream.
Endotoxin in the blood. That sounds bad. What does that do?
It triggers inflammation. Systemic, body-wide inflammation. Your immune system freaks out and releases inflammatory signals, cytokines, things like TNF-alpha, IL-6, and it's this chronic, low-level inflammation sparked by the gut problems caused by the sugar. That's what he argues ultimately causes inflammatory-driven insulin resistance. Your cells basically become deaf to insulin signal because there's all this inflammatory noise going on.
Wow. So just to recap, seed oils break the energy factories, the mitochondria, directly. And processed sugar messes up the gut, which then causes inflammation, which then causes insulin resistance. 2 distinct paths.
Exactly. That's the key distinction he draws about how these two, super common ingredients fundamentally undermine our metabolism in different ways.
This inevitably leads to a tougher question the source brings up. Is there a financial incentive in our current system to, keep people sick? Is marketing and lobbying actually promoting these unhealthy foods?
Oh, he absolutely makes that argument. He paints a picture of a system where, frankly, there's a lot of money to be made from chronic illness.
Let's start with big food, as he calls it. How does he say their marketing works?
He talks about just the sheer volume, the relentless advertising for processed junk, Frosted Flakes, Skittles, Oreos, sodas, constantly bombarding us. He argues this essentially programs us from childhood to see these as normal, even fun foods. He specifically calls out things like Coca-Cola funding research groups. He mentions the Global Energy Balance Network to push this idea that you can just out-exercise a bad diet, shifting the blame away from the quality of the food onto just, calories in, calories out. And he critiques slogans like all foods fit as being actively misleading.
And then there's Big Pharma. What's his take there?
Well, he points out something quite stark. The U.S. and New Zealand are basically alone in allowing drug companies to advertise directly to consumers on TV. He claims media outlets have become really dependent on that advertising revenue, huge budgets from pharma companies, Pfizer sponsoring shows, things like that. He actually suggests that if you ban those ads, it would radically alter the media landscape and maybe the health information people get.
He also digs into a specific government program, SNAP, pronounced SNAP, right? The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
Yes, SNAP. Used to be called food stamps. He cites data suggesting over 70% of SNAP funds go towards processed junk food. And get this, 10% specifically on soda alone. So his proposed solution, from his perspective, is pretty straightforward. Stop allowing SNAP funds to be used for these clearly unhealthy items.
But he acknowledges that's not a simple proposal politically.
Right. He mentions the pushback arguments that it's classist or racist or elitist because it would disproportionately affect low-income families who rely on SNAP. And he ties this back to lobbying, too, saying companies like Coca-Cola actively fight against any restrictions on what SNAP can buy.
So putting it all together, he sees this as intentional.
He uses phrases like concerted effort and intentional misleading. He argues it's driven by profit. Processed foods are just way cheaper to make, they last forever on the shelf, and the profit margins are much higher compared to fresh, whole, single-ingredient foods. It's simply more profitable, in his view, to sell stuff that contributes to long-term sickness than it is to sell nutrient-dense, perishable food.
Okay, so faced with this system, what's the simple solution he offers for individuals wanting to take control?
It's most deceptively simple, and it loops back to that historical perspective. Eat single-ingredient foods. Meat, fish, eggs, fruit, vegetables, things that are just themselves. By definition, doing that automatically cuts out almost all processed foods, including those seed oils and refined sugars, because they're almost never single ingredients.
He has that memorable rule for checking, doesn't he?
Yeah, the great-grandmother rule. Read the ingredients on a package. Would your great-grandmother recognize everything on that list? He uses the McDonald's bun example, comparing its massive list of additives, including seed oils, to just traditional bread made with flour, water, salt, maybe yeast. It's a stark difference.
And when it comes to picking those single ingredients, especially animal proteins, he offers some guidance on quality.
Yeah, he does. For fish, he suggests being cautious with farm-raised due to potential contaminants like PCBs, heavy metals, maybe microplastics. Checking the source is key if you can. For pork and chicken, which are monogastric, like us, simple stomachs, he notes they tend to store the fats, including PUFAs and potentially pesticides from their feed, which is usually corn and soy. So if possible, prioritizing pastured or organic is better, though he gets that sourcing truly pasture-raised consistently can be tough and expensive.
But he seems to really favor red meat.
Definitely. Beef, bison, lamb, elk, these are ruminants, animals with complex stomachs. He explains their digestion processes fats differently, so they don't accumulate those PUFAs in the same way monogastrics do. They tend to have a better fatty acid profile. He sees them as part of a healthy ecosystem, especially when grass-fed, and points out that finding good quality single-ingredient red meat is often easier, even in regular supermarkets. He personally eats red meat like 99% of the time and thinks the whole fear around saturated fat from quality animal sources is just wrong, scientifically unfounded when you look closely.
He also describes his own eating style, calling it animal-based. What does that involve?
It's basically centered on high-quality animal foods, meat, organs, eggs, then supplemented with things he considers benign or beneficial plant foods, primarily fruit and honey. He also includes raw dairy for some people who tolerate it well. He talks quite a bit about potential gut benefits of raw milk, citing studies linking it to lower rates of asthma and allergies, though he's careful to emphasize needing safe, clean sources because, while rare, contamination is a risk with raw milk. He also mentions colostrum as a powerful supplement.
What about macros, protein, fat, carbs? Does he give guidelines?
Yeah, a pretty simple starting point. Aim for about 1 gram of animal protein per pound of your ideal body weight, or maybe lean body mass. Then you basically fill in the rest of your energy needs with fat and carbohydrates from those quality sources. So animal fats, fruit, honey, maybe things like winter squash. He's generally not a fan of very low-carb or strict keto diets long-term for most people. He thinks carbs from good sources are fine and maybe even beneficial, unless there's a specific therapeutic reason for keto.
He does acknowledge that making these changes isn't always a walk in the park in today's world.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about real-world hurdles. Food deserts, for instance, where finding affordable, quality food is genuinely difficult, and the sheer addictive nature of processed foods, they're literally engineered to make you crave them. Plus, the time factor. People think cooking real food takes too much time, although he argues that time is maybe the best health investment you can make. He even mentions things like apps, like Yuka, that can help identify additives quickly, but cautions they might have their own biases against some foods he recommends, like red meat.
But despite all those challenges, the underlying message from the source seems incredibly hopeful about our body's potential to heal.
Deeply optimistic, yeah.
Mhm.
He strongly believes that most of these chronic diseases plaguing us are not just preventable, but in many cases actually reversible through changing what you eat and how you live.
That's huge. What kind of conditions does he claim to have seen improve or even fully reverse?
He lists a really wide spectrum. Things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, obviously, but also depression, even suicidality, skin issues like eczema and psoriasis, inflammatory bowel diseases. He mentions people avoiding surgery, like getting colostomy bags reversed, infertility, autoimmune conditions. The list goes on. And he suggests significant changes can happen surprisingly fast, weeks to months for major shifts, though some things might take longer. It's about removing the triggers and giving the body the right materials.
It's not just diet, right? He touches on other lifestyle pieces too.
Definitely. Sleep is huge for him. Prioritizing sleep, respecting your circadian rhythm, simple stuff like using red light bulbs at night, avoiding blue light from screens before bed, movement, exercise ideally outdoors if possible, or doing things you actually enjoy, whether that's surfing like him or martial arts or just body weight stuff, sprinting.
Being outside seems like a recurring theme.
Very much so. Getting sunlight, actual full spectrum light. UV for vitamin D, maybe testosterone, infrared light for mitochondrial health. He also talks about grounding or earthing, literally walking barefoot on the earth. He suggests it might help with inflammation via electron exchange, though acknowledges it's complex and still being studied. His point is that spending, 90+% of our time indoors, disconnected from the natural world, is profoundly unnatural historically and likely has health costs.
He even gets practical about navigating social life while trying to live this way.
Yeah, it takes being intentional, right? Like finding restaurants that cook with good fats, not seed oils, or maybe shifting social dinners earlier so you're not eating late and messing up your sleep, and applying that root cause thinking elsewhere, like with low testosterone, addressing sleep and diet before jumping to TRT.
He also mentions EMFs, electromagnetic fields, though maybe with a bit more caution.
Yeah, he touches on it. Concerns about proximity to cell phones, Wi-Fi routers, maybe turning them off at night, using Ethernet cables, based partly on subjective feelings and some ongoing research. But he does acknowledge it's a complex area, maybe not as clearly understood yet as the impact of diet.
So, bottom line, diet seems to be the biggest lever in his view, but things like environment, maybe past trauma, they can play a role too. And it's not like this diet is a 100% cure-all for every single person, but it's the crucial first step.
That's exactly it. Focus on the biggest things first, the foundational inputs. And for him, that's overwhelmingly diet, coupled with those basic lifestyle factors that align with how humans evolved.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. The core message from this source really seems to be, our modern health crisis, this epidemic of chronic illness, is largely fueled by processed foods. Specifically, he singles out refined seed oils and processed sugar. He argues this whole situation is perpetuated, maybe even intentionally, by marketing and lobbying from the industries making these foods. And the solution, while maybe challenging in practice, is fundamentally simple. Get back to eating real single-ingredient food, the stuff our ancestors ate. Avoid the industrial food machine.
Right. And the real power the source offers isn't just what to avoid, but why. Understanding those mechanisms, how seed oils impact mitochondria, how sugar drives inflammation via the gut, that knowledge, he believes, empowers you to make fundamentally different choices that could potentially not just prevent, but actually reverse chronic conditions and just dramatically upgrade your health.
Which really leaves you with a final thought to chew on. If going back to these older patterns of eating and living holds the key to fixing so many modern diseases, what other parts of our ancient human experience, our ancestral lives, might hold forgotten secrets to health and vitality that we're just completely ignoring right now here in 2025?